I know you want this.
Yes, more.
Come here, let me show you.
November 3rd, 2023. Martin Reeves installed the camera at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. His daughter Emma had been acting strange for weeks. The new tutor, Alex, had been coming twice a week for a month. Martin watched the feed from his office downstairs. What he saw in the first 10 minutes made him reach for his old FBI badge. What he saw in the next hour made him lock his gun safe. Emma wasn't being tutored. She was teaching Alex something she'd learned from studying Martin's old case files, the behavioral profiles, the killer interviews, the psychological breakdowns of every monster he'd ever hunted. His daughter had been taking notes, practicing techniques. And Alex wasn't her victim. He was her first student. For 8 years, Martin thought his biggest failure was letting those children die. Now he realized his biggest failure was coming home every night to the one person who'd been watching him closer than any killer ever had. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Martin's hands trembled as he stared at the laptop screen, the blue glow casting shadows across his weathered face in the darkened office. The timestamp read 4:23 p.m. Emma and Alex had been upstairs for 36 minutes, and every second had unraveled 8 years of carefully constructed denial. On the monitor, his daughter sat cross-legged on her bed, a manila folder spread between her and the young graduate student. Martin recognized that folder. He'd been searching for it for weeks, assuming he'd misplaced it during one of his late-night bourbon sessions. The Riverside Killer case files. His most successful profile. The one that had made his career before Portland destroyed it. Emma's voice came through the hidden microphone with crystalline clarity. "The key isn't the violence itself," she was saying, her tone clinical, detached. "It's the control. Look at page 47, Dad's interview notes with Kirkland. See how he breaks down the victim selection process?" Alex leaned forward, his dark hair falling across his eyes as he studied the document. The vulnerability assessment. He's not just choosing random targets. Exactly. Emma's smile made Martin's blood freeze. It was the same expression he'd seen on her face Christmas morning, the same one from her elementary school plays. But now it carried something else, something predatory. Kirkland spent weeks studying his victims, learning their routines, their fears, their psychological weak points. It's all about finding the perfect moment when someone's defenses are completely down. Martin gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white. These weren't the casual conversations of a teenager fascinated by true crime. Emma was speaking with the authority of someone who'd studied the material, absorbed it, made it her own. "Your turn," Emma said, closing the folder and sliding it toward Alex. "Practice the assessment technique. Start with me." Alex straightened, suddenly uncomfortable. "Emma, I don't think..." "It's just an exercise." Her voice carried a subtle edge that made Martin's profiler instincts scream. Manipulation through false reassurance, textbook predatory behavior. How would you approach me if I were a target? What would you identify as my vulnerabilities? Martin watched Alex wrestle with the request, saw the exact moment the young man's academic curiosity overrode his moral hesitation. Another red flag. Emma was reading Alex's psychological responses in real time, adjusting her approach accordingly. "Well," Alex began slowly, "you're isolated. Homeschooled since your parents' divorce. Limited social circle. You have abandonment issues from your mother leaving." "Good." Emma's interruption was sharp, approving. "But you're being too gentle. A real predator wouldn't dance around the wounds. They'd press directly on them." Martin's chest tightened. How did Emma know these techniques? He'd never discussed methodology at home, never brought casework into their family life. At least he thought he hadn't. But sitting here now, watching his daughter demonstrate master-level psychological manipulation, he wondered how many conversations she'd overheard, how many late-night phone calls she'd monitored from the top of the stairs. "Try again," Emma commanded, "and this time, mean it." Alex's second attempt was brutal in its precision. He systematically dissected Emma's emotional architecture, her fear of abandonment, her desperate need for intellectual validation, her resentment toward Martin's career obsession. Each observation hit its mark with surgical accuracy, and Emma guided him through the process like a conductor leading an orchestra. Martin reached for his phone to call 911, then stopped. What would he tell them? That his daughter was teaching manipulation techniques to her tutor? That she'd stolen his old case files? None of it was technically illegal, but every instinct honed through 20 years of hunting monsters told him he was watching something catastrophically dangerous take shape. On screen, Emma was opening another folder. Martin's breath caught as he recognized the tab, Victimology Studies, Active Cases. Those files should have been locked in his home safe, not scattered across his teenage daughter's bedspread like homework assignments. "Now for the advanced lesson," Emma said, her voice dropping to an almost hypnotic whisper. "What we've been building toward." She pulled out a photograph, a school ID picture of a young girl Martin didn't recognize. Blonde, maybe 14, with the kind of trusting smile that made predators salivate. "Sarah Morrison," Emma announced. "Sophomore at Lincoln High. Single mother, works double shifts at the hospital. Gets home alone every day at 3:15, walks the same route through Laurelhurst Park." Alex stared at the photo, and Martin saw something shift in the young man's expression. A hunger awakening. "How do you know all this?" Alex whispered. Emma's smile returned, cold and calculating. "Because I've been practicing, Alex. Everything Dad taught me about hunting monsters, I've been learning to apply from the other direction. And you're going to help me find out if it actually works." Martin's office door was 15 feet away. The stairs to Emma's room were 32 steps. His service weapon was locked upstairs in the bedroom safe, the combination burned into his muscle memory from 8 years of PTSD nightmares. But as he watched his daughter hand Alex Chen a detailed surveillance report on a 14-year-old girl, Martin realized that all his training, all his experience hunting killers, had failed to prepare him for the most terrifying possibility of all. What do you do when the monster lives in your own house? The laptop screen went black. Martin stared at the dead monitor, his reflection ghost-like in the dark surface. Somewhere upstairs, floorboards creaked. Emma's room, directly above his home office. He could hear muffled voices, but the words were lost now, leaving him alone with the echo of his daughter's clinical pronunciation, Sarah Morrison. "Sophomore at Lincoln High." His hands found the bourbon bottle in the bottom desk drawer without conscious thought, muscle memory from 8 years of 3 a.m. guilt sessions. The amber liquid burned, but it couldn't wash away the taste of copper that had flooded his mouth the moment Emma smiled at that photograph. He'd seen that exact expression before, in interview rooms, behind two-way glass, in the dead eyes of killers who spoke about their victims like chess pieces. The Riverside Killer case file lay open on his desk where he'd pulled it weeks ago, chasing insomnia and old ghosts. Thomas Kirkland's booking photo stared up at him, and Martin's stomach lurched as he recognized something in the killer's documented expression that matched what he'd just seen on his daughter's face. The same cold calculation, the same predatory patience. "Everything Dad taught me about hunting monsters." But that was impossible. Martin had been scrupulous about separating work from family, especially after the divorce. Sarah had accused him of bringing darkness into their home, of contaminating Emma with his obsession with evil. She'd fought for full custody, claiming Martin's work made him an unfit parent, that their daughter was already showing signs of his unhealthy fixations. He'd won the custody battle, but Sarah's words had haunted him. He'd installed better locks on his office, moved all case files to a secure safe, never discussed work at the dinner table. For 8 years, he'd maintained that boundary religiously. Yet somehow, Emma had absorbed it all anyway. Martin walked to his office safe, fingers trembling as he entered the combination. The heavy door swung open to reveal neat stacks of active case files, cold cases, psychological profiles, his entire professional life cataloged and secured. But now, he saw the gaps. Manila folders slightly askew, documents missing from their proper sequence. How long had she been taking them? How many nights had Emma crept down here while he slept off another bourbon stupor, systematically educating herself in the psychology of predators? The bourbon bottle was calling again when his phone buzzed. Text message from his ex-wife. "How's Emma doing with the new tutor? Still thinking about letting her go back to regular school next year." Martin's throat closed. Sarah had been pushing for Emma to return to Lincoln High, the same school where Sarah Morrison was a sophomore, where a trusting 14-year-old walked home alone every day at 3:15 through Laurelhurst Park. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. What could he possibly say? "Actually, Sarah, I think our daughter might be grooming a graduate student to help her stalk teenagers. By the way, Emma's been stealing FBI case files and studying serial killer methodologies." Instead, he typed, "Everything's fine. Tutor is working out well." The lie felt like acid in his chest. Footsteps on the stairs, light, familiar. Emma's voice drifted down. "Thanks for today, Alex. Same time Thursday?" Her tone was perfectly normal, the voice of any teenager saying goodbye to a tutor. Martin minimized his laptop screen and grabbed a random insurance file, pretending to review damage assessments, as the front door opened and closed. Emma appeared in his office doorway, backpack slung over one shoulder, looking every inch the brilliant but troubled teenager he'd been trying so hard to protect. Dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, oversized sweater hiding her thin frame, the kind of pale complexion that came from spending too much time indoors. His heart clenched with the same fierce protectiveness he'd felt since the day she was born. "How was the session?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Good. Alex is really smart. We're working on advanced psychological analysis." She moved into the room, and Martin caught a whiff of her lavender shampoo, the same brand she'd used since middle school, such an ordinary, innocent detail. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you think some people are just born different? Like, fundamentally wired in a way that makes them see the world differently than everyone else?" The question hung in the air between them like a loaded weapon. Martin studied his daughter's face, searching for any trace of the cold predator he'd seen on the monitor. But all he found was Emma, his Emma, looking at him with the same curious intelligence that had always made him so proud. "I think," he said carefully, "that we all have the capacity for both good and evil. The difference is in the choices we make." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "That's what I figured you'd say." She kissed his forehead, the same goodnight ritual they'd maintained since childhood, and headed upstairs. Martin listened to her bedroom door close, then pulled out his phone and searched for Sarah Morrison's address. The girl lived 6 blocks away. Martin stared at the glowing address on his phone screen until the numbers burned into his retinas. 1247 S.A. Ash Street, 6 blocks away. Close enough for Emma to walk past on any errand, close enough to establish patterns, close enough to... The phone rang in his hand, the sharp trill cutting through the silence like a scream. The caller ID made his blood freeze. Portland PD, Detective Division. "Martin Reeves." "Martin, it's Detective Lisa Park. Sorry to call so late, but we need you to come in. Tonight." Lisa's voice carried the same flat urgency Martin remembered from his FBI days, the tone that meant someone was dead, and the clock was already ticking. He'd consulted on 3 cases for Portland PD since leaving the bureau, insurance fraud investigations that required psychological profiling, but this felt different. "What's the case?" "Not over the phone." "How soon can you get here?" Martin glanced toward the ceiling, listening for any sound from Emma's room. "Give me 30 minutes. The drive to the Portland Police Bureau building passed in a blur of streetlights and mounting dread. Martin's mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Had they found Sarah Morrison? Had Emma moved faster than he'd anticipated? Or was this something else entirely? A coincidence that would prove his paranoia was just another symptom of his deteriorating mental state. Detective Park met him in the lobby, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled, dark circles under her eyes, suggesting she'd been working the case for hours. "Thanks for coming. We're in conference room B." She led him through familiar hallways that smelled of industrial coffee and bureaucratic desperation. Martin had walked these corridors dozens of times during his consulting work, but tonight they felt different, charged with the same electric tension he remembered from his hunting days, when the profile was coming together and the killer was finally within reach. Conference room B contained a war room of evidence. Crime scene photos covered one wall, witness statements scattered across the central table, and in the corner, a laptop displaying security camera footage frozen on a timestamp from earlier that evening. "Victim's name is David Chen," Park said, watching Martin's face carefully. 24 years old, graduate student in psychology at Portland State. The name hit Martin like a physical blow. Chen, Alex's last name. Family? Martin managed. Older brother reported him missing 6 hours ago. Alex Chen, also a grad student at PSU. Park pulled out a manila folder, her movements deliberate. Alex came home tonight and found David's apartment destroyed, signs of struggle, blood evidence. But here's the interesting part. David's laptop was open to research on victimology and predatory behavior patterns. Specifically, case studies from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Martin's vision grayed at the edges. The bourbon from earlier was churning in his stomach, mixing with a cold certainty that his worst fears were only the beginning. We called you because Alex mentioned that David had been studying some old FBI cases, trying to understand psychological manipulation techniques for his thesis. Said he'd gotten hold of some classified case files through an unnamed source. Park's eyes never left Martin's face. Ring any bells? The conference room walls seemed to be closing in. Martin forced himself to study the crime scene photos with professional detachment, but his trained eye immediately caught details that made his blood freeze. The positioning of overturned furniture, the blood spatter patterns, the precision of the violence, controlled, methodical, almost clinical. It looked exactly like the work of someone who'd studied his Riverside killer profile in intimate detail. There's more, Park continued. We found this in David's jacket pocket. She slid a small piece of paper across the table. Martin recognized the handwriting immediately, the same careful script that had appeared on birthday cards and homework assignments for 16 years. David, thank you for helping Alex understand the practical applications. Tonight's lesson will be very educational. Martin? Park's voice seemed to come from very far away. You look like you've seen a ghost. He had. The ghost of every case he'd ever worked, every profile he'd ever written, every technique he'd developed for hunting monsters. All of it weaponized by someone who knew his methods better than anyone, because she'd been learning them her entire life. Detective Park, Martin said, his voice barely above a whisper, I need to tell you something about my daughter. The words hung in the air like a confession, and Martin realized that his old life, the careful facade of suburban normalcy, the insurance investigations, the quiet evenings with Emma, was over. In its place stretched a nightmare he'd never imagined possible, hunting a killer who shared his DNA and had learned everything she knew about murder from studying his life's work. Outside the conference room window, Portland's lights sparkled in the darkness, and somewhere among them, Emma was putting 8 years of stolen lessons to use. Martin's confession hung in the sterile air of Conference Room B, like a toxic cloud. Detective Park's pen had stopped moving, frozen above her notepad, her eyes locked on his face with the kind of professional skepticism that meant she was already calculating how much of his story to believe. My daughter has been... The words felt like glass in his throat. She's been taking my case files, studying them. I think she may have made contact with your victim. Emma Reeves, Park said slowly, as if testing how the name sounded in the context of a murder investigation. 16 years old. Your custody arrangement shows she lives with you full-time. Martin nodded, unable to speak. Park was already transitioning into interview mode, and he recognized the shift, had seen it countless times when suspects started talking. The careful neutrality, the way she angled her body to suggest conversation rather than interrogation, even as every word became potential evidence. Martin, I need you to think carefully before you answer this. When was the last time you saw Emma tonight? Around 9:30. She said goodnight after her tutoring session ended. The words came automatically, but even as he spoke them, Martin realized how little he actually knew about Emma's evening. He'd been so focused on the surveillance footage, so rattled by what he'd witnessed, that he hadn't verified anything. But I didn't actually see Alex leave. Park made a note. Alex Chen confirmed he was tutoring your daughter this evening. Said the session ended around 9, normal curriculum work. But David was already missing by then. She paused, studying Martin's expression. Is there something else you're not telling me about these tutoring sessions? The laptop with the frozen surveillance footage seemed to pulse in Martin's peripheral vision like a guilty conscience. He could tell Park about the hidden camera, about Emma's clinical discussion of victim psychology, about the photograph of Sarah Morrison. But doing so would mean admitting to illegally recording a minor, even his own daughter, and potentially destroying any chance of building a legal case. Instead, he heard himself saying, Emma's always been fascinated by my work. Even after I left the bureau, she asked questions about criminal psychology. I thought it was normal teenage curiosity, but now you think it might be something more. The careful phrasing hung between them, neither question nor statement. Martin recognized the technique. Create space for the subject to fill with their own guilt, their own admissions. He'd used it himself hundreds of times. I think, Martin said carefully, that my daughter knows more about predatory behavior than any 16-year-old should. Park's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, and Martin caught a flicker of something, surprise, maybe concern, before her professional mask slipped back into place. That was the crime scene team. They found something else in David Chen's apartment. She pulled up a new photo on her tablet, angling it so Martin could see, hidden under his mattress. The image showed a manila folder labeled in Emma's distinctive handwriting, Advanced Studies, Practical Applications. Inside, Martin could see photocopies of his own case files, but these weren't random selections. Someone had curated them specifically, choosing cases that demonstrated escalation patterns, victim selection criteria, and what the FBI called control methodologies. It was a graduate-level curriculum in predatory psychology. Jesus, Martin whispered. There's more. David Chen's browser history shows he'd been researching Sarah Morrison for the past week. School schedule, home address, family situation. Everything Emma mentioned in your surveillance footage. The words hit Martin like a physical blow. Park knew about the camera. She'd known all along, had been waiting for him to admit to it voluntarily. His mind raced through the implications. If they'd already obtained the footage, if they'd seen Emma's lesson with Alex, then his daughter wasn't just a person of interest anymore. She was a suspect. Martin, I need to ask you directly. Where is Emma right now? He pulled out his phone, fingers shaking as he scrolled to Emma's contact. The call went straight to voicemail, her voice bright and normal, asking callers to leave a message. The sound of it, so achingly familiar, made his chest tighten. She's not answering. When we ran David Chen's phone records, we found 17 calls to a number registered to Emma Reeves over the past month. The last call was placed at 8:47 p.m. tonight, about 10 minutes before his brother found the apartment destroyed. Park stood, her movement sharp and decisive. Martin, I'm going to need you to stay here while we send a unit to your house. This is no longer a consultation. This is a missing persons investigation that may be connected to a homicide. The conference room door opened and 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. Martin recognized the configuration, one to stay with him, one to escort Park. Standard protocol when a family member became a potential flight risk. Detective, Martin said as Park gathered her files, there's something else. Emma mentioned a girl named Sarah Morrison tonight. If she's escalating, that girl could be in immediate danger. Park paused at the doorway, her expression grim. Sarah Morrison was reported missing by her mother 2 hours ago. The words hit Martin like a sniper's bullet, precise, devastating, final. Sarah Morrison was missing. The 14-year-old girl whose photograph Emma had studied with clinical detachment was gone, and the timeline matched perfectly with everything he'd witnessed on that damning surveillance footage. No, he whispered, but the denial felt hollow even to his own ears. No, Emma wouldn't. She's just a child herself. Detective Park's expression held no comfort, only the grim professionalism of someone who'd seen too many parents, refused to accept what their children were capable of. The Morrison girl was last seen leaving Lincoln High at 3:15 this afternoon. Her mother expected her home by 4. When Sarah didn't show up for dinner, she called it in. Martin's mind raced through the geography of his neighborhood, mapping distances and timing with the same methodical precision he'd once used to track serial killers. Lincoln High to the Morrison house, 12 minutes walking. His house to Lincoln High, 8 minutes by car. Emma could have easily intercepted Sarah's route home, could have offered help or friendship or any of a dozen lures that would seem innocent coming from a teenage girl. The uniformed officer beside him shifted slightly, and Martin caught the subtle movement of a hand toward handcuffs. Not quite a threat, but a reminder. He was no longer a consultant on this case. He was the father of a suspect, possibly an accomplice, definitely someone who'd concealed evidence and obstructed justice. Martin, Park said, her tone gentler now but no less serious. I need you to understand something. The surveillance footage you collected, Emma's conversation with Alex about victim psychology, the photograph, the discussion of hunting techniques, that's not just concerning behavior anymore. It's potential evidence in a kidnapping case. The words kidnapping case reverberated through the conference room like an echo in a tomb. Not a psychology experiment gone wrong, not teenage rebellion taken too far. A federal crime with a living, breathing, terrified victim. Martin thought of Sarah Morrison's school photo that would be plastered across news broadcasts within hours. Blonde hair, braces, the kind of trusting smile that predators specifically targeted. His phone buzzed with a text message. The officer beside him tensed, hand moving toward his weapon, but Park nodded for Martin to check it. The message was from Emma. Dad, staying overnight at study group. Don't wait up. Love you. That's Emma, Martin said, his voice cracking. She says she's at a study group. Park was already moving, pulling out her own phone. We'll need to trace that message. See if we can triangulate her location. She paused, studying Martin's face with the penetrating stare he remembered from his own interrogation days. Has Emma ever stayed overnight anywhere without your explicit permission before? The question forced Martin to confront a truth he'd been avoiding for months. Emma's increasing independence, her vague explanations about where she'd been, her growing collection of new friends he'd never met. He'd attributed it to normal teenage development, to his daughter finally emerging from the shell she'd retreated into after her parents' divorce. But now those innocent explanations crumbled under the weight of what he knew. She's been distant lately, he admitted, more secretive. I thought it was normal teenage behavior. Or she was preparing for something, Park said quietly. Martin, I need you to think back over the past few months. Any changes in Emma's routine? New interests? People she mentioned meeting? Anything that might help us understand her endgame here? The question hit him like a punch to the solar plexus, because it forced him to acknowledge the terrible possibility that everything, the tutoring sessions, the stolen case files, even her recent academic focus on psychology, had been building toward this moment. Emma hadn't been randomly experimenting with predatory techniques. She'd been methodically preparing for a specific operation. Oh God, Martin breathed, the realization crushing down on him like a physical weight. She's been planning this for months. The conference room fell silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of the police station at night. Martin stared at the crime scene photos spread across the table, at David Chen's destroyed apartment, at the carefully curated case files that represented years of his professional expertise weaponized by his own daughter. But the worst part wasn't the evidence of Emma's preparation or the clinical precision of her methodology. The worst part was the growing certainty that everything he'd seen so far was just the beginning. Emma hadn't just studied his old cases. She'd learned from their mistakes, refined their techniques, evolved their methods. She wasn't copying the killers he'd once hunted. She was surpassing them. Park's radio crackled to life with the voice of the unit dispatched to Martin's house. Detective Park, we're at the Reeves residence. House is empty, but you need to see what we found in the daughter's bedroom. Martin's hands trembled as Park's radio crackled again, the officer's voice cutting through the electric tension of the conference room. Detective, we're sending photos now. You're going to want everyone to see this. Park's tablet chimed with incoming images. She angled the screen toward Martin, her expression carefully neutral, but he caught the slight tightening around her eyes, the look of a seasoned investigator confronting something that defied expectation. The first photograph showed Emma's bedroom, but not as Martin remembered it. Gone were the typical teenage posters and scattered textbooks. Instead, one entire wall had been transformed into what could only be described as a hunter's shrine. Crime scene photographs, his own case files, were arranged in meticulous chronological order. Red string connected victims to perpetrators to locations, creating a web of violence that spanned decades of his career. But it was the center of the display that made Martin's vision blur. A large photograph of Sarah Morrison, school yearbook quality, surrounded by detailed notes in Emma's precise handwriting, height 5 feet 4 inches, weight approximately 110 lbs. Lives alone with mother, divorced, father relocated to Seattle, walks home via Elm Street daily. Trusting personality, eager to please authority figures. Ideal subject for trust-based approach. Jesus Christ, Martin whispered. Park swiped to the next image. Emma's desk had been cleared of homework and teenage clutter, replaced by what looked like a forensic investigator's workspace. Surgical gloves, zip ties, a detailed map of Portland with 3 locations circled in red ink, and beside it all, a leather-bound journal labeled Operational Notes in Emma's handwriting. Your daughter documented everything, Park said, her voice professionally distant but edged with something that might have been amazement. The officers on scene found 47 pages of detailed planning. Victim selection criteria, location scouting, even contingency plans for different scenarios. The tablet displayed page after page of Emma's journal entries, each one more chilling than the last. Martin recognized his own teaching methodology, the systematic approach he'd once used to train FBI profilers, but twisted into something unrecognizable. Emma had studied not just his successful cases, but his failures, analyzing where previous killers had made tactical errors and how those mistakes could be avoided. Day 23, subject responds well to academic discussions. Alex has proven more cooperative than anticipated. his psychology background makes him an ideal accomplice. He believes we're conducting theoretical research for his thesis. Useful fiction. She manipulated Alex Chen, Martin breathed. He wasn't her accomplice, he was another victim. Park nodded grimly. The journal entries make it clear. Emma convinced Alex he was helping with legitimate research, gradually escalating his involvement until he was too deeply implicated to back out. Classic manipulation psychology. Martin's mind reeled as the pieces fell into place with sickening precision. The tutoring sessions hadn't been academic. They'd been Emma's laboratory for testing psychological manipulation techniques on a willing subject. Alex's graduate studies in psychology had made him the perfect test case, intelligent enough to provide useful feedback, but naive enough to miss the true nature of Emma's experiments. Day 35. Alex expressed concern about the practical applications aspect of our research today, reminded him that understanding predatory psychology requires experiencing the power dynamic firsthand. He agreed to help with the Morrison project after I explained how it would enhance his thesis credibility. She's been training him for weeks, Martin said, his voice hollow, conditioning him to accept increasingly questionable activities by framing them as academic research. There's more. Park swiped to a new section of the journal. Emma documented her analysis of your old cases in detail. She identified what she calls operational failures in the killers you profiled, specific mistakes that led to their capture. The entries that followed read like a graduate-level course in criminal methodology, but written by someone with intimate access to FBI investigative techniques. Emma had cross-referenced crime scenes with autopsy reports, studied interview transcripts to understand how killers had revealed themselves under interrogation, even analyzed the psychological profiles Martin himself had written to identify gaps in his understanding. The Riverside killer's primary error was emotional attachment to specific victim types. This created a predictable pattern that allowed Dad's profile to anticipate location and timing. Lesson: avoid psychological consistency that creates investigative patterns. Martin felt physically sick. She's not just copying them, she's improving on them. Your daughter appears to be designing what she considers a perfect crime, Park said, using your expertise to eliminate the behavioral patterns that typically lead to apprehension. The final journal entry was dated that morning. Dad installed surveillance equipment in the study. He suspects something but doesn't understand the scope yet. This confirms he's still operating from protective instincts rather than investigative ones. His emotional attachment to me remains his greatest weakness, and my greatest advantage. The words hit Martin like a physical blow. Emma hadn't just discovered the hidden camera, she'd known about it all along. Every conversation he'd witnessed, every chilling revelation that had brought him to this conference room had been deliberately performed for his benefit. She wanted me to find the footage, he whispered. She's been manipulating me too.